Hello, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. So New Zealand against South Africa, the game in the Rugby Championship that was given a big billing and was what we expect from these fixtures between these two sides. Full-blooded, physical, plenty to talk about. That's what I'm getting into in this video. So if you haven't seen the result, if you're waiting to see the highlights, this is probably the part where you want to stop the video and come back later once you have caught up to speed. For those of you that have watched the game, then drop a comment down below. What did you make of the performance of both sides? What do you make of the result and anything that I touch upon in the video? Make sure you subscribe to the channel and that you like the video as well. Always appreciate that one, but let's get into it. So New Zealand 35, South Africa 20, the full-time score, and a match really which at one point looked like it was going to be a complete blowout. I mean, the opening 15 minutes from the All Blacks was as good a rugby as you will see, I think. They were utterly dominant, and sure, South Africa will look back on it and think they were dropping off tackles and they were ill-disciplined, but that's also what comes from being put under pressure, and that's exactly what the All Blacks did to the Springboks. 17-0 up after 15 minutes, scored 2 tries, one for Aaron Smith and one for Shannon Frizzell. Both brilliant tries. That first try, actually, the Aaron Smith try, came after only 5 minutes or so, and the ball had been in play for 3 minutes straight. I think there'd been one scrum which had stopped proceedings in that opening 5 minutes, but other than that, it was ball in play. It was the All Blacks going through the phases, making ground in their carries, and then finishing off the try as well. And then the second of those tries, the Shannon Frizzell one, was another excellent score as well, down the left-hand side, and a powerful finish from the back row, who I will get back onto because I thought Shannon Frizzell was excellent once again. But as I say, that opening 15 minutes was brilliant to watch from my perspective as a neutral. I think South Africa's defence just didn't really look like it was there. It's always a difficult thing to balance when you're looking back at something like this, because to what extent is it just that the All Blacks were so good, they were breaking the gain line on every carry, they had the momentum, that it's also very difficult for the Springboks to be able to counteract that, and what part of it was the Springboks not quite being there? Because I thought it was a little ironic in a way that a lot of the talk before the game was about how South Africa had flown a contingent of players out to New Zealand early to get over the jet lag, to help them in their preparations and hope to be in the best place possible for this match. And actually it looked like the Springboks were the team that were maybe just a little bit off it in the opening 20 minutes. You felt like it probably took them the first quarter of the game to fully get into it, because after that period it was a much closer match, but the damage had pretty much been done. Not fully, because South Africa did come back into it, but you just dug yourself a pretty big hole to try and get yourselves back out of, really. Also within that period, it was notable to me, the New Zealand kicking game. They mentioned it in the coverage that I was watching over here in the UK, which was a kicking game which kept the ball in play, and those kicks early on were very contestable, and New Zealand backed their wingers and their fullback in the air to get the better of the Springboks, and it worked really well for that opening, and for most of the first half actually. The kicks started to be a little bit too long in the second half, but that was an element of the game that I thought was interesting, because when I looked at that opening 20 minutes, I wrote down on my notes here, is it a blueprint of how to beat the Springboks? But I think you could maybe actually rephrase that, because I think for New Zealand, this is a blueprint of how we can win the World Cup, because I don't think it matters who they're playing against. If they can play with that level of intensity, with that level of physicality and that speed of ball, I don't think there's a team in the world that would be able to live with them. The question, I guess, for New Zealand is, can they play like that on a consistent basis? Because once again, they did drop off, and to a degree that's normal. I think maintaining that level is incredibly difficult, but that is what separates the best sides as well. So if I was an All Blacks fan, I'd be really encouraged by the opening 2 weeks of the Rugby Championship. It hasn't been perfect. I'm going to come on to it in a second about them once again losing the second half in a match. But overall, they have shown that when they play at their very best, they can trouble anyone, and they can not just trouble anyone, they can absolutely blow them away, because it's what they did. They matched South Africa physically. They got themselves over the gain line. I mean, their carries were just going forward and forward early on, and then they were able to capitalise because we know how good they are. So maybe just a few things to think about there, but certainly from a New Zealand perspective, if they can be more consistent, if they can play like that, then I think there won't be a team out there in the world that won't be fearful of facing them if they can get to that sort of form on a really consistent basis. They were absolutely brilliant. Final thing I wanted to mention in the first half was the Cheslin Kolbe no try, where there was kind of a little crossfield kick and he went up, him and Barrett, and it was fumbled on the floor. No try was given. I felt actually like it could have gone either way, personally, because you've got to remember the knock-on laws are so ridiculous that you don't have to be in control of the ball to ground it and to score a try, essentially. All you have to do is have some sort of downward pressure. I thought maybe he had enough downward pressure. I mean, it happened pretty quickly because they were watching it in slow-mo. There wasn't much connection there between then him knocking the ball on. I just wondered whether that would have been a try. Not a huge point, really, given how the game ended. But yeah, that was just my take on perhaps it maybe should have been a try, but then I think it's probably not a big deal and there'll be other people that will disagree. It was a tight one, wasn't it? Let's get into the second half because that's actually where the game got probably a lot more interesting. It was 20 points to 3 at half-time. South Africa, obviously, with the no try. Interestingly, they took a penalty fairly late on in the half. If I was the Springboks, I would have actually taken a penalty earlier on. They had another one which they kicked to the corner. I think before we got to the no try for Cheslin Kolbe that I just spoke about, that if I was at that point, I would have taken the 3 points to get yourself something on the board, which they didn't do. They ended up taking a penalty later in the half. And then in the second half, the Springboks were much improved. And the comeback was on at one point because once again we saw the impact of that South African bench. They went to the bench really early in the second half. I thought that was interesting. 3 minutes into the second half, they brought on their replacements and they just started to keep coming. And Vermeulen, Steph du Toit, Malcolm Marx all had a massive impact. And I was looking at it and thinking, God, you know what? They could be on here, South Africa. They could be on for the comeback potentially because the Springbok bench or the New Zealand bench at first wasn't having as big an impact, I didn't think. And it kind of brings me on to the point. New Zealand had done enough, and they actually scored some pretty nice tries in that second half as well. And they did a pretty good job of riding that South African momentum and then scoring a couple more tries to take the game away from the Springboks. But if you look at the scoreboard and you think that it was 23 at half-time and then 35-20 at full-time, it's another match where New Zealand have lost the second half. And I know this was something that was spoken about after the win against Argentina, where they had an absolutely brilliant first half and then there's a drop-off. I think when you're dominating a game, it's always natural to have a bit of a drop-off. But at what point does it become a real cause for concern for New Zealand? Because I think it comes back to what I mentioned already, which is consistency. When New Zealand are at their best, if they can be that consistently, they are potentially going to end up being World Cup champions at the end of this year. But the reason they won't, I think, at this moment in time is because of that consistency, losing the second half, that drop-off in their play. It seems to be happening quite regularly. I'll be interested to hear from New Zealand fans on that one. On how big a concern is it, what you think it is? Is that surely mental, I guess, if it happens that consistently? It can't always be down to your opponents. I think it has to rest with you. But yeah, a number of tries in the second half. Will Jordan got on the score sheet, obviously, because it's what he does. And in fact, he was absolutely outstanding for New Zealand. I know there's a lot of calls for him to play fullback. He was excellent on the wing. And then I wanted to mention Shannon Frizzell as well, who, again, is another guy I think will be getting a huge amount of plaudits. During that opening 15 minutes that I mentioned, he was brilliant. Carrying, beating defenders, breaking tackles, scoring a try. And before the Rugby Championship, before this season, any of you who would have watched some of my previews on the All Blacks already would have heard me say that I wanted to see more from Shannon Frizzell at international level. I think we're starting to see that because, again, I just thought he was really, really good. He gives them a physicality at 6, which I think complements the rest of that back row really, really nicely. So I was pleased with his performance. As I say, Will Jordan got a try, Richie Mwanga got a try, and then Kwagga Smith scored a try pretty late on. Cheslin Kolbe got a try as well for South Africa, and Malcolm Marx got on the score sheet as well. So New Zealand had a quiet start to that second half, but ultimately they had enough there to get the job done. Those are kind of my thoughts on this game. Let me know how you saw it down below. What did you make of it from a Springbok and from an All Blacks perspective? I think for South Africa, they go away now and they've it's just a little reminder, isn't it? A shot across the bow. They've been going pretty well if you consider kind of the back end of last year, beating England at Twickenham, statement win against Australia. I mean, look, Auckland, New Zealand haven't lost there since 1994 or something like that. So it's never an easy place to go. South Africa, I think, will still be confident of being able to perform when it comes to the World Cup. But particularly what they saw in that 20 minutes where they were utterly blown away, it's maybe given them a few things to focus on. And likewise, that 20 minutes from New Zealand, if they can turn that into 40 minutes, 60 minutes, dominating more of games, they're going to be a pretty tough team to beat. I look forward to reading your comments. Like the video and subscribe to the channel as well. And I'll see you in the next one.